The fog clung to the tarmac of RAF West Hampnet like a damp shroud, smelling of brine from the channel and the omnipresent oily reek of high-octane spirit. It was a coldness that seeped through the sheepskin of my flight jacket, a coldness no Texan sun could ever truly burn away. I stood there, my boots clicking against the oil-stained concrete, feeling a strange agitation of the soul. Back in San Antonio, I had dreamt of the nightly tilt of the Great War, of wind-whipped scarves and the noble pursuit of the horizon. But here, under the leaden sky of southern England, the war felt less like a tournament and more like a factory. Loud, greasy, and impatient. Beside me stood Flight Lieutenant Miller, a man whose face seemed carved from the very chalk of the cliffs he defended. He didn't look at me. He looked at the silhouette emerging from the mist. "There she is, Vance," Miller said, his voice a dry rasp. "The Mk.IIC. Not as dainty as the Spitfire, I grant you. She's a bit of a pugilist, broad-shouldered and thick-skinned." I squinted. I had spent my training hours in the nimble AT-6 Texans and had seen the sleek lines of our own P-36s back home. The Hawker Hurricane looked, by comparison, like a barn door with an engine strapped to it. It sat high on its wide-track landing gear, its hump-backed spine giving it the appearance of a predator coiled to spring, yet weighted down by its own heavy bones. It lacked the aesthetic grace of a thoroughbred, but there was a ruggedness to the fabric-covered fuselage and the massive, three-bladed Rotal propeller that commanded a begrudging respect. "She looks like she could take a hit from a sledgehammer and keep flying," I remarked, shoving my hands deep into my pockets to hide the slight tremor of anticipation. "She can," Miller replied grimly. "But that isn't why we brought you over from the Eagle Squadron today. Walk with me." As we approached the wing, I saw them. Protruding from the leading edge were four long, menacing muzzles. They weren't the slender, needle-like barrels of the .30 caliber machine guns I was used to, those little pea shooters that required a pilot to hover on an enemy's tail for an eternity, spraying lead like a garden hose. These were the 20mm Hispano-Suiza cannons. They looked out of place on a scout, too large, too heavy, like the armament of a naval vessel shrunken down and forced into the air. "4 of them?" I asked, my breath hitching. "4," Miller confirmed. 200 rounds of high-explosive and armor-piercing shells per gun. No more paper cutting, Vance. You aren't here to poke holes in the Luftwaffe anymore. You are here to erase them from the firmament." I reached out and touched the cold steel of the outermost cannon. It felt indifferent, a heavy weight of destiny forged in a foundry. In the American Air Corps, we talked about suppressing the enemy. The British, perhaps because they had seen their cities burn under the shadow of the Heinkels, spoke a different language. This aircraft wasn't a scout. It was a flying battery. A group of riggers and fitters were swarming over the engine cowling, their hands blackened by soot. They moved with a frantic, quiet efficiency. One of them, a lad no older than 19, looked up and caught my eye. He didn't smile. There was only a grim sort of pride in the way he polished the glass of the reflector sight. I felt a sudden sharp melancholy, a longing for the wide-open plains of Fort Worth, where the only thing we hunted were coyotes, and the only danger was a sudden dust storm. But as I looked back at the 4 black muzzles of the Hurricane, a different heat began to stir in my chest. It was the American spirit, that restless urge to see just how much thunder one man could command. "She's heavy, Tex," Miller warned, noticing my stare. "She'll fight you in the turns. She's got more torque than a runaway locomotive. But if you get those 4 ladies to speak at once, God help whatever is in front of you." I climbed onto the wing, the non-slip walkway rough under my soles. Reaching the cockpit, I looked down into the office, a cramped, dark green labyrinth of dials, levers, and the smell of stale oxygen and hydraulic fluid. It was a far cry from the pristine cockpits of the stateside trainers. This was a place of business. I settled into the seat, my parachute pack acting as a stiff cushion. I gripped the spade grip control column. It felt substantial. I peered through the windscreen, imagining a Messerschmitt crossing that glass. For the first time since I'd crossed the Atlantic on a crowded transport ship, the apprehension that had been gnawing at my gut was replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I was no longer just a volunteer. I was the hand on the hilt of a fourfold sword. I settled into the cockpit, feeling the tight embrace of the Sutton harness as I pulled the straps over my shoulders. The Hurricane did not coddle its pilot. The metal seat was hard, and the space was a tangled thicket of brass valves, copper piping, and black-faced gauges. To my left, the massive throttle lever waited, polished smooth by the palms of men who had likely already faced the fire. I felt a surge of spirit, a restless desire to wake this sleeping titan and hear its voice. "Priming!" Miller shouted from the wing, his face appearing at the edge of the canopy. I worked the hand pump, feeling the resistance as the 100-octane fuel was forced into the 12 cylinders of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Each stroke of the pump felt like a heartbeat. I checked the magnetos, left, then right, and ensured the mixture was rich. My thumb hovered over the starter button, a small brass nub that held the power to shatter the morning silence. "Clear!" I hollered back, the word echoing off the damp hangar walls. I pressed the button. For a heartbeat, there was only the labored mechanical groan of the starter motor fighting the massive compression of the engine. Then, with a violent, coughing sneeze of blue smoke and a flame that licked out from the ejector exhausts, the Merlin roared to life. The entire airframe shuddered, a bucking, vibrating animal that seemed to resent being tethered to the earth. The sound was not a mere noise. It was a physical force that rattled my teeth and vibrated deep within my chest. It was the sound of 1,200 horses screaming in unison. I watched the needles on the instrument panel dance as the oil pressure climbed. The scent changed instantly. The damp English air was replaced by the hot, metallic breath of the engine and the sharp tang of burnt glycol. I gingerly advanced the throttle, feeling the torque of the massive propeller trying to swing the nose of the aircraft to the right. I had to stomp on the left rudder pedal with significant force just to keep her straight as we began to crawl forward. The Hurricane didn't taxi so much as it waddled, its wide gear thumping over the uneven grass of the airfield. "Easy now, Tex," I muttered to myself, the words lost in the thunder of the engine. "She's a heavy lady, but she's got a temper." I reached for the gun selector switch on the spade grip. There it was, the brass ring that toggled between safe and fire. My mind flashed back to the briefing room, to the technical drawings of the Hispano Mk.IIC cannons. Unlike the machine guns of my youth, which rattled like a frantic woodpecker, these cannons functioned with a rhythmic, pounding deliberation. Each shell was a miniature grenade designed to punch through steel plate and erupt in a shower of jagged shards. As I reached the perimeter of the airfield, I looked out over the long, flat expanse of the takeoff path. The wind was whipping the grass into silver waves. I performed my final checks. Trim tabs set to neutral, flaps up, radiator shutter open. The engine temperature was rising into the green. I looked toward the control tower, where a green flare suddenly arched into the gray sky, trailing a ribbon of emerald smoke. The signal to go. I lined her up, the nose of the Hurricane obscuring the world in front of me. I took a deep breath, tasting the copper-like tang of adrenaline. I wasn't just Silas Vance from Texas anymore. I was a component of a machine designed for the singular purpose of destruction. I pushed the throttle forward, feeling the Merlin swell into a deafening, predatory howl. The tail rose, the horizon rushed toward me, and the 4 black muzzles pointed the way into a sky that was no longer empty, but waiting. The sensation of the Hurricane leaving the earth was not the graceful transition of a bird, but the defiant leap of a heavyweight boxer. As the wheels tucked into the wings with a mechanical clunk, thud, I felt the sudden, exhilarating surge of freedom. The ground fell away, the green quilt of the Sussex countryside blurring into a tapestry of hedges and stone walls. I climbed, the Merlin engine bellowing a steady, rhythmic chant of power that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of my boots. Within minutes, the world below vanished. I punched through the first layer of cloud, a thick, wet fleece of gray that swallowed the wings and turned the cockpit into a solitary cell. For a moment, there was only the glow of the instrument dials and the ghost of my own reflection in the windscreen. Then, with a suddenness that stole my breath, I broke through. Above me was a vault of brilliant, blinding blue, the kind of sky that made a man forget there was a war at all. The clouds below were now a rolling ocean of white foam, stretching out toward the horizon where the English Channel lay hidden in the mist. Yellow 2, this is Yellow Leader. Tighten it up, Tex.
We've got reports of a dozen plus heading for the convoy at Dover.
Miller's voice in my headphones was crackled and tinny, but it snapped me back to the grim reality of the mission. I looked to my left and saw his Hurricane, a dark silhouette against the sun, its camouflage paint looking like mottled moss against the brilliance of the upper air. I kicked the rudder, banking the heavy machine to slide into position on his wing. The Hurricane felt different at 10,000 feet. The controls, which had been sluggish on the ground, were now firm and responsive, though still possessing a certain heft that required a strong hand. It was a physical aircraft. You didn't just fly it, you wrestled with it, commanding its 1,200 horsepower to obey your will. I adjusted the trim, feeling the melancholy of the quiet altitude wash over me. It was so peaceful up here, so far removed from the dirt and the grease of the airfield. Vector 090, the ground controller's voice cut through the static, a calm, feminine English accent that sounded absurdly out of place in a sky meant for killing. Intercept altitude 12,000. Bandits are crossing the coast now. I reached out and clicked the safety catch on the spade grip to fire. A small red indicator light flickered on. My heart began to drum a frantic cadence against my ribs. In the American schools, we had practiced on tow targets, silk sleeves that drifted lazily in the wind. But the Germans weren't silk. They were seasoned hunters in their Messerschmitts, men who had blooded their wings over Spain and Poland. I checked my oxygen mask, ensuring the rubber seal was tight against my face. The scent of the rubber was sharp and clinical. I looked at the 4 cannon muzzles again. They were silent now, cold steel waiting for the spark. I thought of my grandfather's stories of the old frontier, of the heavy buffalo rifles that could stop a charging bull in its tracks. These Hispanos were my buffalo rifles. "Tally-ho! 12 o'clock high!" Miller shouted. I craned my neck upward. There, emerging from the glare of the sun like silver gnats, were the enemy. They were diving, long, slender shapes with the distinctive square wingtips of the Bf-109. The light glinted off their canopies, a series of malicious flashes in the blue. My stomach did a slow, sickening roll, but my hands remained steady. I tightened my grip on the control column until my knuckles went white under my leather gloves. I wasn't just Silas Vance anymore. I was a weapon of the United States, lent to an embattled king, and I was about to unleash a storm that no German had ever truly felt. "Break left, Tex! Break left!" Miller's voice exploded in my ears, stripped of its British reserve. I didn't think. I reacted with the raw instinct of a man who had spent his youth dodging thunderstorms in a Stearman. I slammed the stick to the side and stood on the rudder pedal. The Hurricane groaned, a deep, structural protest that vibrated through the seat of my trousers. Unlike the dainty Spitfire, which seemed to slice through the air, the Hurricane shoved it aside with brute force. The centrifugal force, the G-load, as the boys called the weight of gravity, pressed me down into my seat until my spine felt like it was being driven into the floorboards. A streak of tracer fire, pale and ghostly in the daylight, flashed past my canopy. A Messerschmitt had plunged out of the sun, its engine a snarling whine that I felt more than heard. It was a slim, yellow-nosed shark, its underside painted the color of a pale robin's egg. "I'm on him, Miller! I've got the bastard!" I yelled, the adrenaline washing away the last of the morning's chill. I hauled the nose up, fighting the massive torque of the Merlin. The Hurricane was heavy, a true flying anvil in a high-speed dive, and the controls felt as though they were set in drying concrete. I had to use both hands on the spade grip to haul the sight onto the horizon. My breath came in ragged, shallow gasps against the rubber of my mask, smelling of stale oxygen and my own mounting trepidation. The German pilot was good. He rolled, inverted, and dived toward the white floor of the clouds, his Daimler-Benz engine trailing a thin ribbon of black smoke. I followed, the airspeed indicator needle sweeping past 300, 350, 400 miles per hour. The whistling of the wind around the canopy transformed into a shriek, and the fabric on the Hurricane's fuselage began to drum like 1,000 frantic fingers. "Stay with him, Silas," I hissed through gritted teeth. "Don't let the son of a gun slip away." The Messerschmitt grew larger in my reflector sight. I could see the individual rivets on his tail, the black cross, the Balkenkreuz, stark against the mottled gray camouflage. He was trying to outturn me, banking steeply to the right. In a Spitfire, I might have lost him in the circle, but the Hurricane had a secret. Those thick, sturdy wings allowed for a tighter turn at lower speeds than almost anything in the sky. I felt the aircraft shudder on the edge of a stall, the wings buffeting as the air struggled to stay attached to the metal skin. I was pulling so hard that my vision began to gray out at the edges, a tunnel of shadow that threatened to swallow the world. I eased the back pressure just a hair, centered the needle and ball, and saw the yellow nose of the enemy fighter settle squarely into the center of my orange, glowing ring. My thumb moved to the firing button. My heart was no longer drumming. It was a steady, cold engine of its own. I was an American, thousands of miles from home, flying a British ship with Hispano cannons forged in the fires of a world at war. I wasn't looking for a fair fight. I was looking for an ending. The German pilot leveled out for a fraction of a second, likely thinking he had outdistanced the lumbering Hurricane. It was the only mistake he would ever make. The Messerschmitt hung there, suspended in the amber glow of my reflector sight, like a rare specimen pinned to a board. In that fleeting, almost mystical heartbeat, the surrounding world ceased to exist. The rhythmic thrum of the Merlin engine, the high-pitched whistle of the slipstream against the cockpit canopy, the jagged rasp of my own breath inside the rubber mask, it all receded into a dull, gray background noise. What remained was the cold, mathematical purity of the intercept, a distance of 300 yards, a calculated lead of 2 diameters, and the gray shadow of the enemy, whose broken wing lines seemed a masterpiece of engineering. I did not see a living man behind that armored glass. I saw only a target, a volatile confluence of duralumin, magnesium, and high-octane spirit that stood between me and the safety of the English cliffs. My thumb, encased in the coarse leather of my flight glove, settled onto the firing button. In the training camps back in San Antonio, we had been taught to fire rifle-caliber machine guns. It was a frantic, almost polite sound, a rapid, metallic tatter-tatter-tatter that produced little more than a slight itching sensation in the palms. What happened in the next second aboard my Hurricane Mk.IIC had nothing in common with those pea shooters. When the 4 20mm Hispano-Suiza cannons spoke, it was as if a giant sledgehammer had struck the nose of my aircraft. Boom, 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 boom. The Hurricane didn't just shudder. It bucked like a wild stallion tasting the bit for the first time. The recoil was so colossal that I physically felt the aircraft's forward momentum stutter. 4 long, jagged tongues of orange flame lashed out from the leading edges of my wings, instantly obscured by thick, choking clouds of gray cordite smoke that smeared across my windscreen. The stench of burnt powder, sharp and sulfuric, fought its way through the seals of my oxygen mask, filling the cockpit with the overwhelming aroma of a naval broadside. I watched the shells travel. Because they were a terrifying mix of high explosive and incendiary rounds, they didn't just vanish into the blue. They traced a path of tiny, sparkling detonations through the air. The first burst struck the Messerschmitt's left wing root. In a heartbeat, the sleek, clinical beauty of the German fighter was transformed into a chaotic whirlwind of debris. I didn't see bullet holes in the fabric or metal. I saw chunks of the wing, great jagged shards of duralumin the size of dinner plates, ripped away and tossed into the slipstream like autumn leaves in a gale. The armor-piercing rounds punched through the heavy steel of the engine cowling as if it were wet parchment, while the explosive shells ignited the oil and glycol within. Lord in heaven, I whispered, my voice a ghost in the thunder of the cockpit. The second burst caught the fuselage just behind the cockpit. The sheer kinetic energy of 80 shells per second was more than the slender frame of the Bf-109 could endure. The tail section didn't merely break, it disintegrated. One moment, the enemy was a cohesive instrument of war. The next, it was a blossoming fireball surrounded by a confetti of shredded aluminum. The canopy shattered outward, and for a fleeting, terrible second, I caught a flash of white. A parachute silk, or perhaps the pilot's flight suit, as the aircraft tumbled into a violent, unrecoverable spin toward the white ocean of clouds below. The shock of the spirit was physical. I had expected a duel, a long, drawn-out contest of maneuvers and pecking at the enemy's vitals. Instead, the Hurricane had delivered a single, crushing blow that left nothing but smoke and scorched memories in its wake. It wasn't a dogfight. It was a total erasure. I felt a surge of American pride, a fierce, hot exultation that traveled from my boots to my throat. We weren't just defending a patch of sky. We were rewriting the rules of the air with every pull of the trigger. I hauled the stick back, climbing away from the falling wreckage, my breath coming in jagged, crystalline heaves. My hands, usually as steady as a surgeon's, were humming with a strange, electric energy. I looked at the fire indicator on my panel. It was still red, still hungry for more. I was Silas Vance, a boy from the Texas plains who had come to England looking for adventure. But in this moment, I was the master of the lightning. "Yellow 2 to leader," I called out, my voice cracking with a mix of awe and grim satisfaction. Target obliterated. 1 Messerschmitt confirmed. He didn't even have time to see the hand that struck him. "Copy that, Tex," Miller's voice crackled back, sounding almost bored despite the chaos. "Welcome to the heavy artillery. Keep your eyes peeled. His wingman is diving through the sun. Let's see if you can repeat the performance." I banked the Hurricane hard, the heavy wings feeling lighter now, as if the aircraft itself was invigorated by the carnage it had wrought. I scanned the blinding blue vault of the sky, my eyes sharp and predatory. I was no longer an observer of this war. I was its most devastating participant. The scent of cordite lingered in the cockpit, a sharp, metallic ghost that refused to dissipate even as the slipstream roared past my canopy. Below, the remains of the first Messerschmitt were already swallowed by the gray floor of the clouds, leaving only a dark, greasy smudge in the air that was quickly torn apart by the wind. I didn't feel the melancholy of the victor. Not yet. There was no room for the quiet contemplation of a soul's departure when the sky was still alive with the scream of engines and the lethal geometry of tracers. "Yellow 2, he's coming about! 3 o'clock high!" Miller's voice barked in my ears, cutting through the electric hum of my nerves. I snapped my head to the right. There, cutting through the glare of the sun, was the second yellow-nosed fighter. He wasn't running. He was diving in a wide, aggressive arc, his engine a high-pitched snarl that seemed to vibrate the very glass of my windscreen. He had seen his wingman vanish in a heartbeat, and now he was coming for the eagle who had struck the blow. I hauled the Hurricane into a climbing turn, my muscles straining against the heavy controls. The aircraft felt like a massive iron-bound door being forced open against a gale. The G-force pressed me into the seat, and for a moment, the world narrowed to a tunnel of gray shadow. I could feel the structural groans of the airframe, the fabric on the rear fuselage drumming a frantic rhythm against the wooden stringers. This was the raw, physical reality of the Hurricane. It didn't dance, it wrestled. The German pilot was seasoned. He didn't commit to a straight pass. Instead, he rolled his fighter, using the superior roll rate of the Messerschmitt to keep me from getting a lead on him. We entered a vertical scissors, a deadly aerial ballet where each man tries to slow down and maneuver behind the other. Up and down we went, our engines howling in protest as we fought for the advantage. "Come on, you son of a gun," I hissed, my teeth bared behind the rubber mask. "Just 1 second. Just one look." I watched his silhouette against the blinding blue. He was sleek, agile, a silver needle darting through the sky. But the hurricane had a trick of its own. As we reached the apex of a climb, just as the airspeed indicator dropped toward the stall, I kicked the rudder hard. The thick wings caught the air with surprising grip, and the nose of the hurricane snapped around with a violence that would have stalled a lesser ship. For a fraction of a heartbeat, the Messerschmitt's belly was exposed, a pale, robin's egg blue target. He was less than 200 yards away. I didn't wait. I squeezed the trigger. Boom, 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 boom! The four Hispanos spoke again, their recoil shaking the entire aircraft as if we had hit a stone wall. The first two shells missed, streaking past his tail like miniature comets. But the third and fourth found their mark. I saw the flashes, brilliant orange-white bursts on the underside of his wing. The explosive force didn't just punch a hole, it sheared the entire wingtip off. The Messerschmitt lurched violently to the side, its aerodynamic balance shattered. It began a high-speed rolling tumble. I watched as the pilot struggled to jettison the canopy, the glass glinting in the sun as it flew away. A moment later, a dark shape was flung from the cockpit, a small figure falling through the vast emptiness of the sky until a white silk canopy blossomed above him. I leveled out, my chest heaving, the agitation of the spirit finally settling into a cold, hard clarity. I had used 800 rounds of 20mm death in less than 10 minutes. Two of the Luftwaffe's finest were gone, one to the earth and one to the wind. I looked at my hands. They were steady now, gripping the spade grip with a quiet, terrifying authority. I was a long way from the quiet cattle ranches of Texas, and the boy who had left them was gone, replaced by a man who knew the weight of a cannon's roar. "Good show, Tex," Miller's voice came through, calmer now. "The rest of them have turned tail for France. Let's head for home before the fuel gets thin. I believe there's a bottle of scotch in the mess with your name on it." I banked the hurricane toward the west, the sun catching the long black barrels of my guns. They were cooling now, their work done for the day. As I looked out over the horizon, I saw the white cliffs of Dover emerging from the mist, a silent ancient wall of stone that looked, for the first time, like it was truly mine to defend. The descent from the high, silent theater of the heavens was a slow return to the world of men and mud. As I throttled back the Merlin, the predatory roar faded into a mechanical grumble, a weary protest from 12 cylinders that had been pushed to their absolute limit. The air grew thicker, warmer, and smelled once more of the damp English earth. I looked down at my hands. The leather of my gloves was stained dark with sweat, and a fine layer of gray cordite soot had settled into the creases of my flight suit. I banked the hurricane over the perimeter fence of West Hampnet, the wide landing gear thumping into place with a reassuring hydraulic groan. The landing was far from graceful. The aircraft was heavy, its fuel tanks low and its ammunition bins nearly empty, making it feel tail-heavy and temperamental. We bounced once, twice, before the thick rubber tires gripped the grass and stayed down. As I taxied toward the dispersal hut, I saw the ground crew waiting. They didn't cheer. They didn't wave their caps. They stood with their hands on their hips, their eyes fixed on the 4 black muzzles of my cannons. They knew the language of the guns. They could tell, even from a distance, which barrels had spoken and how much of their lethal harvest had been sown into the sky. I cut the mixture. The Merlin gave one final, shuddering gasp and fell silent. The sudden absence of noise was deafening, a physical weight that pressed against my eardrums. I sat there for a long moment, my hands still resting on the spade grip, staring at the blurred horizon through the oil-streaked windscreen. "Oi, Tex! You all right in there?" It was Sergeant Higgins, the lead rigger, a man whose face was a map of grease and determination. He was standing on the wing root, peering into the cockpit. I slowly slid the canopy back, the cool, mist-laden air rushing in to replace the stifling heat of the office. "I'm fine, Higgins," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears, raspy and stripped of its usual Texan lilt. "She's a hell of a ship, but she's hungry. She ate through a lot of shells today." Higgins jumped down and began to inspect the leading edges of the wings. He whistled low between his teeth. "Blimey, sir, look at the soot on these muzzles. You didn't just fire 'em, you gave 'em a proper workout. The blast tubes are scorched halfway back to the spar." I climbed out, my legs feeling like two pillars of lead as I dropped onto the grass. I walked around to the front of the aircraft. The Hurricane looked different now. It was no longer a barn door or a flying anvil. It was a scarred veteran. There were streaks of oil along the belly and a small jagged hole in the fabric of the rear fuselage, a parting gift from the second Messerschmitt's wingman that I hadn't even felt during the heat of the fray. "Two confirmed, Higgins," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "One went down in pieces. The other lost a wing and bailed out." The sergeant paused his inspection, his soot-stained hand resting on the barrel of the No. 3 cannon. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something other than professional duty in his eyes. It was a grim, shared understanding. 20mm high X, sir," Higgins said quietly. "It don't leave much for the undertaker, does it? It's a clean sort of killing, I suppose. No peck-pecking as you lot call it. Just a thunderclap and then nothing." I looked away, toward the line of trees at the edge of the airfield. I felt a sudden, sharp melancholy, the spleen of the victor.
Back home, we talked about the glory of the air, about the nights of the clouds. But standing there in the damp grass, smelling the cooling metal and the burnt powder, I realized that the Hispano cannons had stripped away the last of the romance. This wasn't a duel. It was industrial-scale destruction. I was an American volunteer, a hero in the making for the folks back in Fort Worth. But at this moment, I felt only the heavy burden of the iron I carried. The Hurricane had proven its worth, and I had proven mine, but the cost was written in the smoke I had left behind at 12,000 feet. "Get her refueled and rearmed, Sergeant," I said, straightening my back and trying to find the Tex they expected me to be. "The Luftwaffe won't wait for us to finish our tea." "Right you are, sir," Higgins replied, snapping a sharp salute. "We'll have the four voices ready for the next scramble." I turned and began the long walk toward the debriefing hut, my shadow stretching out long and thin across the oil-stained turf. Behind me, the armorers were already lugging the heavy crates of 20mm shells toward my wings. The cycle of the war was turning again, and I was just one more cog in its relentless, grinding machinery. The mess hall was a low-slung wooden hut that smelled of stale tobacco, damp wool, and the faint, sweet aroma of tinned peaches. It was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where the war was supposed to stay outside the door, yet it permeated every shadow. I pushed through the heavy blackout curtains, the warmth of the cast-iron stove hitting my face like a physical blow. The sudden transition from the freezing cockpit to this humid, human-filled room made my head swim with a brief, dizzying melancholy. A dozen pilots were scattered around the room. Some were hunched over battered copies of the Times, while others sat in slumped silence, staring into the depths of their chipped porcelain mugs. There was no cheering for my return. In the RAF, a kill was often treated with the same weary detachment as a successful delivery of mail. "Vance, over here, you mad Texan!" Miller called out from a corner table. He looked older than he had 3 hours ago. The soot from his own exhaust had left dark rings around his eyes, making him look like a weary phantom. I navigated the maze of mismatched chairs and sat down, my flight suit rustling in the quiet. I felt a surge of my old American bravado, the urge to slap the table and recount the way the Messerschmitt had turned into 1,000 pieces of scrap metal. Back in Fort Worth, such a story would have earned me a round of drinks and a front-page headline. But here, the silence was heavy, a thick English blanket that muffled even the loudest of egos. "2 of them, Miller," I said, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as I leaned forward. "The first one, the cannons just chewed him up.
I've never seen anything like it. It wasn't a fight, it was a god-awful explosion. Miller took a slow, deliberate sip of his tea. He didn't look impressed. He looked tired. The Hispano is a blunt instrument, Tex. It's effective, yes, but it's also a heavy burden for the Hurricane to carry. You'll find the extra weight makes her a bit of a pig in a steep climb. Don't let the power make you careless. I felt a prickle of irritation. Careless? I brought the ship back with barely a scratch on her. Those cannons are the best thing to happen to this war since the invention of the parachute. Miller finally looked up, his gaze steady and piercing. They are a necessity, Silas, a grim one. We are no longer scouts. We are flying executioners. There is a difference between the two that you'll come to understand when the adrenaline fades and the night sets in. I slumped back into the worn leather of the armchair. The exaltation I had felt in the air was beginning to sour, turning into a hollow, aching fatigue. I looked around the room and realized that these men weren't just tired. They were hollowed out. They had seen too many explosions, too many friends vanish into the gray channel mist. My American heroism felt thin and gaudy in the face of their quiet, stoic exhaustion. Sorry, I muttered, rubbing my face with my hands. I guess the shock of the spirit hasn't quite worn off yet. It never truly does, a voice came from across the room. It was a young sergeant pilot, barely 20 years old, who was nursing a bandaged hand. You just get used to the weight of the iron. The Hurricane is a good girl. She'll keep you alive. Just remember that every time you pull that trigger, someone's mother loses a son, even if he is a yellow nose. The room went silent again, the only sound the crackle of the stove and the distant, rhythmic thumping of a generator. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I could still see the flashes of my cannons, the orange tongues of flame licking out into the blue. I could still smell the cordite. I was a long way from Texas, and the four voices of thunder were a heavy song to sing. I realized then that the Hurricane hadn't just changed the way I fought, it had changed the way I saw the world. I was a dealer of lightning now, and lightning leaves nothing but scorched earth in its wake. The afternoon sun hung low and bloated over the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the airfield. We had barely finished our tea when the teleprinter began its frantic, rhythmic clicking, a sound that always set my teeth on edge. The scramble was no longer a novelty. It was a summons to the altar of the machine. I stood up, my joints popping like dry kindling, and felt the familiar heaviness of the spirit settle over me. We weren't just going up to hunt. We were going up to shield. Blenheims, Miller said, his voice tight as he buckled his Mae West. 12 of them. They're heading for the docks at Ostend to give the Jerrys a taste of their own medicine. We're to pick them up over the coast and see them home. The flight to the rendezvous point was a study in tension. The sky had turned a deep royal violet, and the air was as smooth as glass. I flew yellow too, tucked tight into Miller's starboard quarter, my eyes constantly scanning the empty vastness for the telltale glint of an enemy's wing. Below us, the channel was a dark, restless expanse of leaden water, white-capped and unforgiving. Then I saw them. The Bristol Blenheims. They looked like silver dragonflies, flying in a tight, disciplined Vic formation. They were slow, vulnerable, and beautiful in their stubborn persistence. My task was simple: stay above them, stay alert, and let nothing touch them. Bandits! 10 o'clock high! Coming out of the haze! The call came not from Miller, but from a frantic voice in the bomber formation. I looked up. There, diving through the purple light, were at least 20 Messerschmitts. They weren't interested in us. They were diving straight for the unshielded bellies of the bombers. Engage, Yellow Section! Keep them off the big boys! Miller commanded, his Hurricane banking steeply into a climb. I pushed the throttle through the gate, feeling the emergency boost kick in. The Merlin engine screamed, a jagged, metallic howl that vibrated through my very bones. I didn't wait for a maneuver. I went straight for the lead German fighter. He was lining up a shot on the trailing Blenheim, his nose already beginning to sparkle with machine gun fire. "Not today, you son of a gun!" I hissed. I hauled the Hurricane around, the G-force slamming me into the seat until my vision narrowed to a pinprick of light. I was too fast. The controls were like iron, but I forced the nose down with every ounce of my strength. I didn't need a long pursuit. I didn't need a graceful dance. I had the four voices. I centered the glowing amber ring on the Messerschmitt's cockpit. I was close, barely 100 yards away. I could see the pilot's head turn, a flash of recognition as he saw the humpback silhouette of the Hurricane looming over him. I squeezed the trigger. Boom, 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 boom. The roar of the four Hispanos was even louder in the thin, cold air. The recoil was so violent that it felt as though the wings might snap from the fuselage. The shells didn't just hit the enemy, they erased him. One moment there was a fighter, the next, there was only a colossal orange-white explosion that lit up the darkening sky. The Messerschmitt didn't fall. It vanished into a cloud of burning gasoline and shredded metal. I flew straight through the debris, the sound of shrapnel peppering my wings like a handful of gravel. I didn't flinch. I banked hard to the left, looking for the next target. My heart was no longer racing with fear. It was beating with a cold, steady rhythm. I wasn't just Silas Vance from Texas anymore. I was the sovereign of this patch of sky, the protector of the men and the silver dragonflies below. 2 more yellow noses tried to break through. I didn't give them the chance. I didn't even use a full burst. Just 2 short, sharp stabs of the trigger were enough to send them spiraling toward the cold, dark water of the channel. The power of the cannons was absolute, a final, undeniable argument in the debate of the air. As the last of the Germans broke off and headed back toward France, I leveled out and looked down at the Blenheims. They were still there, still flying their tight, stubborn formation. One of them dipped its wings in a silent salute. I felt a sudden, sharp exultation, a hot, fierce pride that made my eyes sting. We had held the line. We had used the thunder to bring the light home. "Good show, Tex!" Miller's voice came through the static, sounding almost human for the first time. "I think you finally learned what those cannons are for. They aren't just for killing. They're for keeping the world from going dark." I banked my Hurricane toward the west, following the long golden path of the setting sun toward the white cliffs. I was a long way from home, but as I looked at the 4 black muzzles of my guns, I knew that as long as they had a voice, the sky would belong to us. The English twilight was a bruised purple, bleeding into a deep oceanic indigo at the edges of the world. As I turned my Hurricane away from the smoke of the channel, the cockpit was bathed in the soft, spectral glow of the instrument dials. The phosphor-painted needles hummed with a ghostly light, oil pressure, fuel, boost, each one a silent witness to the mechanical strain of the last 30 minutes. My hands, still locked around the spade grip, felt as though they had become part of the airframe itself, fused by adrenaline and the rhythmic pounding of the cannons. I looked out over the trailing edge of my wing. The Blenheims were smaller now, mere silver specks retreating toward their own bases in the north. We had brought them back. Against a swarm of 20 yellow noses, we had stood our ground with the sheer, brutal authority of the Hispano. It wasn't the chivalry of the air I had read about in Sunday papers back in Fort Worth. It was something far more modern and far more terrifying. It was the sovereignty of superior fire. "Yellow leader to yellow 2, Miller's voice came through, devoid of its usual clipped frostiness. "The coast is clear, Tex. Ease her back. You've pushed that Merlin hard enough to wake the dead." I throttled back, feeling the vibration of the engine smooth out into a low, contented purr. The agitation of the soul that had plagued me since I first stepped onto this damp island began to subside, replaced by a heavy, quiet dignity. I wasn't just a volunteer looking for a thrill anymore. I was a guardian of the gate. As the white cliffs of Dover rose out of the gloom like the teeth of a giant, I looked down at the 4 cannon muzzles. They were cold now, their long barrels streaked with the soot of a dozen kills. I thought of the German pilots, men who had likely spent years perfecting their craft, only to be erased in a fraction of a second by a weapon they couldn't outmaneuver. There was a profound melancholy in that realization, a weight that no amount of metals could ever truly lighten. I was an American, a son of the wide-open prairies, but in this twilight hour, I felt as though I belonged to this ancient, embattled earth. The Hurricane, with its fabric skin and its heart of iron, had made me a part of its story. It wasn't the prettiest ship in the sky, and it certainly wasn't the fastest, but it had a soul that matched the stubbornness of the people it defended. I banked over the perimeter lights of West Hampnet, the amber lamps flickering like candles in the mist. I lowered the flaps, feeling the drag of the air as the Hurricane slowed for the final approach. The landing was soft, a gentle kiss of rubber on grass, as if the aircraft itself was as exhausted as I was. I taxied to the dispersal point and cut the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the tink-tink-tink of the cooling metal. I sat there for a long time, staring at the darkening sky through the windscreen. I didn't want to get out. I didn't want to face the questions or the bravado of the mess hall. I just wanted to be Silas Vance, a man who had seen the thunder and lived to tell the tale. Higgins was there again, waiting with his clipboard and his grease-stained cap. He didn't say a word as I climbed down. He just reached out and patted the fuselage of the Hurricane, his hand lingering on the scorched paint near the cannon ports. "She did well today, sir," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper in the night air. "She did, Higgins," I replied, pulling off my leather helmet and letting the cool night wind blow through my hair. "She's a sovereign of the skies, and as long as she's flying, the lights won't go out." I turned and walked toward the debriefing hut, my boots heavy on the damp grass. I knew that tomorrow would bring more scrambles, more fire, and more smoke. But as I looked up at the first stars beginning to twinkle through the English haze, I felt a strange, quiet peace. I had found my place in this great, terrible machine of history. I was the hand on the sword, and the sword was sharp.